Everyone, Ollie here, and this is the 22nd edition of Olly Ranks, where I'll be ranking season 22 of Classic Doctor Who. So, season 22 is the first full season of Colin Baker, although he actually made his debut in the end of season 21, so this is technically his second season in a way. So, in this season, things go back to basics in a way, with Doctor Who going back to Saturday nights, and instead of airing it in 4 parts of 25 minutes, it now airs in 2 parts or even 3 parts, with all equating to all having 45 minutes. So it was a good idea at first, but then I think it started running a bit thin midway through the season, and unfortunately, because of the BBC starting to lose trust in Doctor Who, and they made their feelings about it very aware, and of course Michael Grade, who is literally looking at every single opportunity to try and cancel Doctor Who. So the BBC pretty much decided to cancel Doctor Who at the end of this season, but then it was able to be reversed, and instead of the cancellation, it went on an 18-month hiatus, meaning the plans for the original 23rd season had to be shelved, or then eventually cancelled. I think some of them were actually adapted into books and later Big Finish stories in several years after that. So, in place of that, we have the Get Trial of a Time Lord, which I'll be getting to later on. So, if you're not familiar with this concept, I'll be ranking all 6 stories of this season from my least favorite to my absolute favorite. So, starting us off in sixth place, you guessed it, Time Lash. The plot wasn't the plot wasn't actually bad, but then the story itself was just dog shite. I mean, the plot was okay, but just needed some fine tuning. But if it was like delayed or something, I definitely think that it would have made things a lot better. But what we got here was just terrible, and it didn't really help that Eric Sale was busy writing Revelation of the Daleks, so the writer Glenn McQuarrie was pretty much mostly on his own. The acting was okay. The Doctor and Perry were quite alright. They do a bit for the plot, but then I just think the side cast was just quite dull, especially aside from Herbert, who was a bit annoying, but then I think when to find out who Herbert actually was, it made him slightly more interesting. And of course, we all know that Herbert is actually young H.G. Wells, who, as we know, is the father of science fiction. The pacing of the story was just terrible. Part 1 was too slow, and part 2 was just a padded mess, and the pacing was just all over the place. It was just, yeah. The main plot was climaxed way too early, and then, which was a result of that, the Banjos, who were pretty much trying to destroy Carfell with a missile, was suddenly remembered, and then that stopped, and then there's pretty much some pacing, and then between 5-10 minutes before that, and then the plot twist of the board actually being a clone was just stupid, and it was just added more into the plot and added into the padding of the story. It was just it was also made in a very low budget, so it just made things even worse. And I think the story was pretty much the final straw for the BBC, and that's how we got the hiatus. So I give Time Lash a 2 out of 10. In fifth place is The Mark of the Rani. Although not as bad as Time Lash, but it was well on its way from being quite as bad. But then I do think there were some parts of the story that actually managed to salvage it, but then there wasn't enough to make it possible. Of course, this story marks the first appearance of the Rani, who is a Time Lord, and she seems to be pretty much superior to the Doctor and the Master on an intellectual level, and think that this story was quite boring most of the times, and there was some fun there, especially with the acting, which was quite pantomimish, but at the same time, it does feel a bit quite dull as well. I didn't really think it worked, and obviously, I think having the master of the story, I think he was pretty much fell under the influence of just very bad campy writing, so to speak, and it was just Anthony Ainley was okay, but then I think it was just a very weird contrast compared to when he last appeared in Planet of Fire, where he was quite menacing, as he actually got hold of Kamini and wanted to destroy the whole planet. Not destroy the whole planet, but pretty much manipulating things to his own gain. But then here he's just very silly, which is just doesn't really work in my opinion. Now, I did like how the story was actually set during the Industrial Revolution, which is what I think saves the story because it had that educational historical feel that was definitely in the William Hartnell era in the story. So it was a nice little mini callback to it. As of course, this is the Industrial Revolution. We actually get George Stephenson, who actually pretty much invented rail travel. So that was a nice little element. So I gave Mark of the Rani a 4.5 out of 10. Fourth place is Revelation of the Daleks. A fan favorite, and I see why it is. Which is theme of the story is actually quite good, but I think that the execution actually fails to capture what the plot was after and what it actually was trying to envision. So obviously, this is a resurrection. This is a sequel to Resurrection of the Daleks, and this is the second part of the Dalek Civil War storyline that was pretty much prevalent in all Dalek stories in the 1980s. And so in this part, Davros has retreated to the planet Necros after almost succumbing to the Movellan virus and this is where he creates his own breed of loyal Daleks, which was the Imperial Daleks. And they were made from dead slash dying humans, and he was operating from a funeral home called Tranquil Repose. The story was quite dark, and it does have some very dark scenes, such as Natasha finding her father, Arthur Stengos, who was pretty much decaying and he was about to be turned into a Dalek. The Doctor and Perry are good here, but I think one of my main complaints is that the story could have been sold without them being there. They were just mainly side characters, and they don't actually turn up to actually do most of the things in the plot until at least part 2. There were some nice effects in the story, like the Renegade Daleks and how they looked. They looked quite interesting, and the glass Dalek looked stunning, and I liked how one of the special effects actually featured one of the Daleks actually levitating to kill Natasha and Gregory, who were trying to escape from the laboratory. The DH I actually did find quite annoying, but I did like his. Even though he had a very interesting backstory, but I do feel like his inclusion was a bit strange, to say the least. Like, he did feel a bit out of place, even though he did provide some clever dark humor. But I think it just after that did feel a bit kind of not weird. It just felt very. It just felt not. He didn't really fit in with the mood of the story, especially after we found out his backstory. Even though it was quite cool how he invented a rock and roll gun to pretty much kill the Daleks, which was quite interesting as well. And I think the Daleks didn't really do a whole lot other than just shooting around for Davros, and I feel like this is more of a Davros story than a Dalek story, so to speak. And obviously, the Renegade does actually show up towards the end, and then I think that was very much a quick fix for this story. I mean, there were some good ideas, but also I do feel as if that Revelation was trying to be a bit more like Rest of the Caves of Androsani, complete with violence, dark themes, and just everything else. I just felt as it just trying to mooch off the success of from Androsani. And I think if it was told in 4 parts in the 25-minute format, the usual format, I think it would have helped the storytelling quite a bit, and it would have helped ease the pacing as well. But the acting was good. Terry Malloy, brilliant as Davros. Sidecast, apart from a few that were okay, but then what can you say? It's a good story, but I think it could have been a lot better, and I don't think it's as good as fans make it out to be. So I give Revelation of the Daleks a 5.5 out of 10. In third place is Attack of the Cybermen. I personally do think that this is one of Colin Baker's most underrated televised stories. Though yes, to understand the plot, you need to have an understanding of the plot of the Tomb of the Cybermen and the 10th Planet. I mean, if you're watching this today, and it would have been quite easy to get because both of these stories are available on DVD and they're not actually missing at the moment. So compared to as it was back when the story first aired, because Tomb of the Cybermen was still very much missing and the 10th Planet was still pretty much incomplete, and it's still incomplete to this day. But then Part 4 has actually been animated, so you can pretty much follow the plot from there. So It was nice seeing the Cybermen back, so they're obviously wanting to hijack Halley's comets to destroy the Earth in 1985 to prevent Mondas from being destroyed the year after, and obviously that's when the tenth planet took place in 1986, and that's when Mondas was destroyed. And then obviously they wanted to destroy the other adopted home planet Telos as well, so they can all go back to Mondas after they succeeded in destroying Earth. So there was seven of them were good, even though they were a bit weak here, considering the fact they were destroyed left, right, and center, but they were still quite cool. The violence was a bit gratuitous at times, especially when the Cyberman was literally crushing Litton's hand, and you can literally see blood like literally pouring down his hand. So that was quite scary, but it was quite interesting as well. And obviously the Cyberman's deaths were quite violent, so to speak. Especially there was a part towards the end of part one where one of the Cybermen actually got shot right through the mouthpiece, and then one of them was like literally like crying in pain, which I thought was quite strange to be honest. Litton, yeah, I think he was quite good here. I think he was definitely better written here than he was in Resurrection of the Daleks, because in it was Litton was actually working with the Daleks in that story, and here it seems that he's working with the Cybermen, but then he's actually working with the Cryons to prevent the Cybermen. So that was a nice twist, and it was definitely good for the Doctor's character development. And speaking of which, I think the Doctor was good here, and I definitely think that Colin Baker was actually good with this story. I think he definitely liked working with the Cybermen. He was worked quite well with them, and it was nice to see that he's not as difficult as he was in his last story. That was the Twin Dilemma. So here and Perry have a good rapport. They're still bickering, but then no, there is a bit of improvement there. So I actually like the ending where the Doctor was lamenting how he misjudged Litton, and if he had listened to him in the first place, he wouldn't have even died. So that was a nice little scene of acknowledgement that here is some development going on. So I give Attack of the Cybermen an 8.5 out of 10. Second place is The Vengeance on Varos. It's a very popular story. It's very hard not to see why it's quite popular. And I think this is where the story where Colin Baker actually shines and manages to mostly shake off the things that pretty much set him up for failure in his era, even though some of the aspects still remain, like the violence and the very dodgy writing, so to speak, even though some of the usual characteristics for the Sixth Doctor actually remains, like he is quite argumentative Perry still, but then it doesn't last long here. The TARDIS is pretty much lands in the punishment dome, and the Doctor and Perry are pretty much thrust into the plot immediately after arrival when they rescue Jonda from execution. And speaking of violence, I mean, this is where this story is pretty much infamous for the Doctor killing two people in the story. But even though that's not the case whatsoever, because at the end of part one, the Doctor passed out of dehydration, and then he was taken to this place where I assume they're going to experiment on him, and there were two guys that were pretty much going to carry this thing out. But then when the Doctor recovers, one of the guys gets scared and falls into the acid pool, whilst the other guy is trying to push the Doctor in, and then they have some kind of struggle, and then the guy that fell into the acid pool first actually drags the guy that was struggling with the Doctor in, and that's how they both die, and the Doctor just pretty much gives off a very funny one-liner and just leaves them. I mean, what can you do when they're tossed into an acid pool? You can't rescue them. They're pretty much, unless you want to go remove them, there's nothing much he could have done. But then he did have, Colin Baker did have some very good moments. I liked his acting when he and John Doe were about to be executed, but then that was just a plot to try and get more information out of the Doctor. As the Doctor did notice that the execution wasn't actually filmed. So I actually like the anti-establishment, anti-government undertone this story actually had, where life from Varos was pretty much in a very harsh regime where the economy was just pretty much terrible, and people were pretty much having to work until they die. And I like how the story was actually told through the eyes of a middle-aged couple, Atta and Eric. They were watching what was going on in the punishment dome from their homes, and they pretty much had to vote for executions and whatnot. And They were a nice little audience. They were literal audience substitute for the story, so that was a nice narrative twist. Yes, and obviously this story introduces us to Syl, and this is this is him right here, very nasty looking fellow. He's quite interesting. He's an interesting villain because he's very sadistic and quite brutal as well. Because he really loved the executions of Varos, and he was willing to distribute the killings of what was the executions to other planets for his own little side hustle as well. There's some very good moments, some very good special effects as well, especially when Perry was about to be turned into a bird woman. That was a very good special effect, as you can see right here. Even though in the story is actually quite brief, but there are some promo shots of it where it actually does happen. So it is quite interesting. So I give this story a 9 out of 10. So in first place is The Two Doctors. I think most would see this as a very controversial opinion to actually put this as a number one choice over some stories, but as I said before in my review, so I'm probably going to say it again, so hear me out once again. It might not be, the script might not be Robert Holmes' best, but I do think that this story was very fun. And I think this is probably this is the most fun story of this season, even though some would argue that the Mark of the Rani is more fun, but I think in the Two Doctors there's more fun aspects of it than there was in Mark of the Rani. Was Mark of the Rani, their type of fun was had to do more with the theatrical acting with the Rani and the Master and the Doctor, whereas this story is actually not only relies on the acting, it is actually Patrick Troughton actually does provide most of them, especially with scenes where he's with Jamie once again, and now he was pretty much an androgam temporarily, so we do have some very fun scenes there. So speaking of which, Patrick Troughton's back, and it's nice, and of course Fraser Hines is back as Jamie, so it's nice to see the second Doctor and Jamie again, and they haven't really lost a beat. So, and I think Troughton had a very good chemistry with Colin Baker, and that really helped benefited the story. And obviously Hines having chemistry with Baker and Bryant, so that really did help the story in terms of having a nice flow amongst the cast. And of course, this story was actually filmed in Spain and in location, and I think having it filmed in Spain made the story even more magical, and it gave off that very rare European holiday feel that this story, that Doctor Who rarely touches upon. It's no City of Death, mind you, but then it does give it that nice little Spanish feel with the nice Spanish music with beautiful scenery. I liked the town. This is actually from set in Seville, so I liked how it was set in the countryside. I liked the Doña Rana's house. I liked the little town Six Perry and Jamie were in to try and find the second Doctor and Shokai. It does feel very majestic and very beautiful, to say the least. To make this, I think what actually does make the story stand out was because I think the location filming of Spain was just beautiful. It just really helped the story as well. And of course, there's a weird bit in the plot when the second Doctor temporarily gets turned into an androgram, so Chesini can actually get the Doctor's symbiotic nucleus, so they can operate the Clark's time machine. But even though as weird as it was, because it was a very fun couple of minutes, even though it was pretty much filler, but it actually helped a lot as well. It was saved with Troughton's performance and how him and the actor that played Shocker had very good chemistry. They had their comedic timing was just very much on point. Right. And I think the story had some very good comedic elements as well. Even though yes, it does have some dark comedy, especially with Shokai and his fascination with eating humans. Even though it did get a bit creepy at some points, but it was quite funny, so to speak. The Santarans are in the story as well, but they don't really do much, and that's what kind of does bring the story down. But then they're pretty much henchmen for Cicini, and they realize that what was going on, and they try to betray Cicini, but then they end up getting killed as well. There were some very graphic scenes and very bloody as well, literal blood, where I think the Sick Doctor gets wounded by Shokai's knife, and you literally see him like administering his wounds, and he kind of leaves like a trail of blood, and we see Cicini, who's an androgram T8, slowly turning back into an androgram. She sees the blood on the floor and she starts licking it. And of course, this is the scene where the Doctor actually kills Shokai by suffocating him to death. So, as much as how gratuitous is violent, how the violence is quite gratuitous in this story, but it is very interesting, and it is a childhood favorite of mine, and a favorite of mine even to this day. So I give this story a 10 out of 10. So, to round off, I do think that season 22 is Colin Baker's best season, but it's a very mixed bag with great stories like Vengeance on Varro's Attack of the Seven and the Two Doctors, but then Revelation of the Daleks pretty much falls into the middle. But if more was done, it could have been a very good story. But then I just honestly think that Time Lash and the Mark of the Ronnie, plus the fuckery that was going on with the BBC trying to get rid of Doctor Who and all that jazz, it kind of does ruin the quality of this season, and it is pretty much indicated that Doctor Who is very much on the decline. So I'll be giving season 22 minus a C minus, which is the lowest grade I've given the season. So thanks for watching, and the next round of reviews will be season 23, where I'll be doing, which will be the Trial of a Time Lord, and that will be Colin Baker's last season, and we're pretty much at the tail end of classic Doctor Who, so stick around for that. Thanks for watching. Please let me know your thoughts of season 22 and this video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Until then, see you later.